The first time you hear the word justice, it sounds simple. Do the right thing, treat people fairly, speak up when something is wrong. We talk about social justice all the time, but we don't always talk about who gets included in that conversation. Scholars like Patricia Hill Collins have documented how race, gender, and sexuality shape access to power and visibility. Queer and trans people of color, indigenous communities, black people outside the US, their experiences often get pushed to the margins or just reduced to hashtags, if they're mentioned at all. And when those stories are left out, it becomes easier to believe that injustice is simple or that it only exists in certain places. But it's not. It's layered, it's global, and it shows up in ways we don't always want to confront. That's why I'm making this podcast, not to speak for anyone, but to listen more closely to the voices that already exist. By bringing together writing, history, and lived experiences shared by queer Black people, this episode creates a space for stories to be heard in their own words. It's a reminder that justice doesn't start with perfect language or viral posts. It starts with paying attention to who we've been ignoring. This episode isn't an interview. This episode brings together the voices, writings, and lived experiences of queer Black people across history and today. These are voices that have always been here, and even when they aren't being listened to. By looking at these stories, we can start to see how anti-Blackness isn't just a US issue, but a global one, and how ignoring intersectional experiences makes real solidarity harder. This podcast is about slowing down, paying attention, and learning from voices that are too often erased. As I listen to conversations about social justice in classrooms, on social media, in activist spaces, I noticed a pattern. Some voices are always loud. Others, the ones most affected, are often missing. That made me ask, who isn't being centered here? Who do we talk about but never actually listen to? For this episode, I wanted to focus on queer Black experiences because they are so often erased, even in spaces that claim to be inclusive. And while I focus here, I also want to acknowledge Indigenous communities and other marginalized groups whose stories are frequently overlooked. Their experiences deserve attention, even if this episode can only touch on them briefly. Listening closely to these overlooked stories helps us see justice differently, not as slogans or as hashtags, but as a real work of understanding, listening, and amplifying voices that society often silences. Before we dive into individual stories, let's step back and look at the system shaping people's lives in ways we don't often notice. Kimberlé Crenshaw first coined the term intersectionality in 1989 to describe how the law and social systems often ignore the compound impact of race and gender and to describe how the law and social systems often ignore the compounded impact of race and gender discrimination, showing why someone can face multiple forms of marginalization at once. Building on this foundation, Patricia Hill Collins and Black feminist thought explores how race, gender, class, and sexuality intersect to shape lives, survival strategies, and communities in ways that are often invisible. Imagine it like layers. Being Black in the US comes with systemic challenges, racism, microaggressions, economic barriers, and then being queer comes with its own pressures, discrimination, exclusion, lack of legal protection, and now imagine being both. These layers don't just stack, they interact. These and they create a reality that's complex, nuanced, and often invisible. And while we're talking about the US, these systems aren't unique here. They echo in Brazil, in the Caribbean, across Europe, everywhere anti-Blackness has shaped society. Collins calls this intersectionality. But intersectionality isn't always about oppression. It shapes survival strategies too. Queer Black communities often create networks of care, chosen families, and support systems because mainstream structures fail them. These networks are acts of resilience, resistance, and political power, simultaneously personal and revolutionary. Understanding this is crucial. Many conversations about justice fail because they simplify identity, ignoring how systems intersect, and unintentionally center voices that are already privileged. Collins reminds us the stories we hear least are often the ones that reveal the deepest truths. Resilience doesn't always look like marches, banners, or headlines. Sometimes it looks like standing up in a room where the world doesn't want you at all. One of the earliest and most overlooked figures in queer Black history is Francis Thompson. Born into slavery in Alabama around 1840, Thompson lived through some of the most violent upheavals in American history. After emancipation, she made a life for herself in Memphis, Tennessee, earning her own wages, building community, and living openly as a woman at a time that the very existence was an act of courage. But Thompson's life took one of its most powerful turns after the Memphis riots of 1866, a brutal moment in the aftermath of the Civil War when white mobs attacked Black neighborhoods, burning homes and churches, leaving hundreds dead or wounded. During the chaos, Thompson and her housemates were among many Black women who were raped by the attackers. Instead of fading into silence or fear, Thompson did something almost unimaginable for a Black trans woman in the 19th century. She testified in front of the United States Congress about what happened. She stood up in front of lawmakers in a time when Black people's rights were still being fiercely contested and when trans identities weren't even recognized, and told the truth about sexual violence and racial terror. Imagine the fear and vulnerability and Imagine the fear and vulnerability she must have carried, yet she walked into a room built by systems that had oppressed her people for generations and said, "This happened, hear me." The mere act of speaking her truth was resistance, not a rally cry with a chant, but a declaration of bodily autonomy, dignity, and courage that reverberated in the halls of power and helped shape early civil rights protections for newly emancipated Black Americans. Thompson wasn't widely celebrated in history books. Her name barely surfaces, but her testimony before Congress stands as one of the first recorded moments where a Black trans woman challenged the nation to acknowledge both racial violence and gendered violence. Her story reminds us that history is filled with lives of resistance led by people we were never taught to remember. Let's take a second and imagine the streets of Memphis after the riots. Smoke in the air, fear in every glance, yet one woman steps forward and speaks her truth. Now imagine a modern classroom, a teenager feeling the weight of society's expectations pressing down, yet finding small, brave moments to exist authentically. Across centuries, across contexts, the act of claiming space for yourself is a revolutionary gesture. Resilience isn't always loud. Sometimes it lives in quiet moments, tucked in classrooms, a bedroom, or a walk home. It's in the small private acts of survival that the world doesn't see. From George M. Johnson's essay for the Human Rights Campaign, we learn how surviving as a queer Black teen often meant navigating survival mode every day, suppressing parts of yourself because society told them they didn't fit the mold. Imagine being 14, feeling something inside you that you are told is wrong, yet it is who you are. Every day, navigating the tension between the world's expectations and your own truth. In the essay, they write about the pressure to adapt to heterosexual norms they never belonged in, the constant fear of rejection, and the quiet courage it takes to exist fully in a world that doesn't want you to. Johnson's story isn't just about struggle, it's about survival, love, and identity. It's about carving space for yourself even when it feels like the world is caving in. Through their memoir, All Boys Aren't Blue, the essays for platforms like the Human Rights Campaign, Johnson shares this lived experience so that others who feel unseen can recognize themselves. These small, courageous acts of visibility are resistance. They are joy. They are life claiming spaces against a world that often erases you. Listening to stories like George's reminds us that queer Black resilience isn't only historical, it's alive today in schools, neighborhoods, and homes across the world. From George M. Johnson's quiet acts of survival in a modern classroom to Francis Thompson's testifying before Congress over a century ago, these stories are connected by more than just identity. They are tied together by the same systems that seek to erase marginalized voices, the same pressures that make living authentically an act of courage. And yet, in every era, resilience finds a way to shine through. In small moments, in acts of visibility, in claiming space that the world tries to deny you. These aren't isolated stories. They are living examples of how overlapping systems of oppression shape lives every day, and how marginalized communities resist, survive, and create power despite them. Collins' theory isn't abstract here. Her work on Black feminist thought helps us see that Thompson's and Johnson's experiences are not isolated, but the result of intersecting systems of race, gender, and sexuality. It is this through line, from past to present, from private moments to public testimonies, that makes intersectionality tangible. Audre Lorde writes, difference is not something to be erased, but a source of strength and understanding. Listening to these stories reshapes how I understand solidarity. It is not enough to show up for a trending post. True solidarity is slower, deeper. Contemporary activists, from grassroots organizers in Black Lives Matter to indigenous-led climate movements, show that centering those most affected requires sustained attention and action, not performative visibility. And this doesn't only happen in the US. Survival, joy, love, and courage under systemic oppression are mirrored across the globe. From New York to Sao Paulo, the rural Alabama to urban London. These stories remind us that oppression isn't confined by borders, and neither is resistance. I find myself asking, how do I show up in my own community? And how do I honor lives that are invisible in history books, news stories, or social media feeds? How do I recognize resilience and courage when it looks quiet, ordinary, or hidden? Difference is not a problem to fix. It's a source of strength, creativity, and insight. Every act of survival, resistance, and joy in the face of oppression is a lesson in humanity. So, if you take anything from this episode, let it be this. Listen, really listen. Amplify the voices, amplify the voices that society tries to silence. Let their courage guide how you think about justice in your own life. When I first planned this episode, my goal was to speak about both the struggles of queer and trans Black communities and the ongoing struggles of Indigenous communities. But the more I dug in, reading reports from the United Nations Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, Amnesty International, and academic studies on Indigenous marginalization, the more I realized both topics are vast, complex, and deserve their own dedicated spaces to be fully explored. That said, as we near the end of this episode, I want to take a few minutes to reflect on the Indigenous erasure alongside queer and trans erasure. Indigenous peoples' histories, stories, and resilience have been systematically ignored in schools, in media, and conversations about justice. Scholars like Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz and reports from the National Congress of American Indians highlight how this erasure isn't just historical. Indigenous communities continue to resist, survive, and claim space in a world that often tries to erase them, much like queer and trans Black communities. Acknowledging Indigenous voices here isn't just an afterthought. It's a reminder that intersectional justice requires us all to pay attention to all communities that have been pushed to the margins, to see the connections, the overlaps, and the ways oppression and resilience weave together across histories and identities. Listening to these stories, from Francis Thompson standing before Congress to George M. Johnson navigating survival as a teen, to communities resisting erasure across the globe, has taught me something essential. Resilience is never quiet by accident. It is a deliberate, courageous, and sometimes daily choice to exist fully in a world that often says you shouldn't. Intersectionality isn't just a theory on page, it's alive in classrooms, in neighborhoods, in homes, and in the histories that are too often ignored. These stories show us how oppression overlaps, how survival can look like love, and how joy itself becomes an act of resistance. And yet, for every story we've heard today, there are countless more voices that remain unheard: queer, trans, Black, Indigenous communities that continue to resist, to celebrate, to survive in ways that are rarely acknowledged. This episode only scratches the surface. I hope this episode sparked curiosity, empathy, and a drive to learn more, to read their words, to seek out histories that have been hidden, to listen to the people who are still here, still surviving, still claiming their space in the world, because understanding starts with paying attention. And from there, action can follow. Thank you.